History records the names of kings and queens who wore the golden circlet, but the chronicles are silent on the one who truly held the strings. In the heart of London, beneath the smog and the weight of tradition, a shadow moved. It was the 17th century, a time of turmoil and transition. While the public cheered for a king who spent his nights in revelry, a silent architect was rebuilding the foundation of the British Empire. This is the story of Eleanor, the woman history forgot, the ruler who governed from the darkness of the palace alcoves, weaving a nation's destiny in silence. Eleanor was never meant to be more than a lady-in-waiting, a ghost in the halls of Whitehall. Yet she possessed a mind sharper than any minister and a resolve as cold as the Thames in winter. She watched as the king, plagued by weakness and indecision, signed away the nation's wealth to greedy courtiers. In the quiet moments after midnight, she would emerge from the tapestry-lined walls, correcting the decrees and drafting new laws in a hand that perfectly mimicked the monarch's signature. The shadows were her kingdom, and silence was her most loyal subject in this secret reign. The throne room was a stage where a grand play was performed for the public eye. King William sat upon the dais, resplendent in silk and gold, but his eyes were vacant and his mind elsewhere. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, Eleanor stood motionless, a silent conductor of this political orchestra. She signaled through subtle cues, the shift of a candle, the closing of a window, directing the king's responses to the petitions of foreign ambassadors. The ministers bowed to the crown, never suspecting that the true power resided in the woman who stood just inches away, hidden by the encroaching darkness. Deep within the palace's labyrinthine library lay a room that did not exist on any architectural plan. Accessed through a rotating bookshelf, this chamber was filled with the scent of old vellum and dried ink. Here, Eleanor kept her secret ledgers, documenting every bribe, every betrayal, and every loyal heart in the city. The lighting was always dim, provided only by a flickering candelabra that cast dancing shadows against the stone walls. In this sanctuary, she was not a servant or a lady, but the sovereign architect of a nation's destiny, working through the long and silent hours of the night. A massive map of the world was spread across a heavy oak table, its edges worn and stained with the passage of time. Eleanor traced the shipping routes with a slender finger, her mind calculating the risks of the new colonies. The British Empire was expanding, not by the king's decree, but by her calculated chess moves. She negotiated with merchant guilds and naval commanders through anonymous letters, ensuring the navy was funded and the trade routes were protected. Every conquest and every treaty was a stroke of her pen, executed in the cold, methodical light of a single flickering candle. Lord Salisbury, the king's most ambitious advisor, had begun to notice a pattern, a consistency in the king's decisions that did not match the monarch's flighty temperament. He prowled the corridors at night, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. Eleanor, pressed against a cold pillar in the shadows, held her breath as he passed. The tension was palpable, a silent battle of wits in the dark. She knew that discovery meant more than her own death. It meant the collapse of the stability she had painstakingly built for Britain. The mystery of the palace was under threat of exposure. Eleanor's eyes and ears extended far beyond the palace gates. She had cultivated a network of the invisibles, urchins, flower girls, and stable hands who saw everything and were noticed by no one. Small, folded notes wrapped in dirty twine were left in the crevices of the garden walls or hidden within baskets of laundry. These messages informed her of brewing rebellions and the secret dealings of the French court. In the dark style of the era, these exchanges were fleeting, ghost-like movements in the London fog, ensuring the secret queen stayed 3 steps ahead of her many political enemies. There were moments when the weight of her invisible crown felt heavier than any gold. Standing before a tall, silver-framed mirror in her private quarters, Eleanor looked at her own reflection, a face the world saw but never truly recognized. The muted colors of her gown blended into the deep shadows of the room. She was the most powerful person in England, yet she could never claim her achievements. The cost of her rule was a life of total isolation, a sacrifice made for the survival of the realm. The parchment texture of the world around her seemed to swallow her whole. During the Great Winter Ball, the palace was a sea of light and music, a stark contrast to the darkness where Eleanor thrived. She moved through the crowd like a specter, her presence unnoticed by the laughing nobles. She watched the king struggle through a conversation with the Spanish envoy, her heart hammering against her ribs. With a discreet movement, she dropped a scented handkerchief near the envoy's feet, a prearranged signal for her agent to intervene. The ball was a minefield of social etiquette and hidden daggers, where a single slip could expose the secret heart of the monarchy. As the first decade of her shadow rule drew to a close, a new threat emerged on the horizon. Rumors of a secret queen began to circulate in the coffee houses of London, whispered like a ghost story by those who felt the unseen hand of power. A radical pamphlet was being distributed, calling for the unmasking of the hidden advisor. Eleanor sat at her desk, the flickering candlelight illuminating the grim determination on her face. The game had changed. The shadows were no longer a perfect sanctuary, and the mystery of her reign was about to face its greatest challenge yet. Eleanor held the crude paper between her fingers, the ink still fresh enough to smudge. It was a radical call to arms, printed on cheap stock, but bearing a dangerous truth. The author, calling himself the Sentinel, claimed that a woman's hand guided the king's quill. This was more than mere gossip. It was a breach of the veil she had spent years weaving. She needed to know who had leaked the details of her existence. Her network of informants was vast, but for the first time, the whispers were coming from outside her control, threatening to collapse the delicate illusion of the monarchy. In the dead of night, Eleanor descended into the labyrinthine alleys of East London, her figure shrouded in a heavy wool cloak. She met her most trusted spy, a man known only as Silas, beneath the dripping eaves of a derelict warehouse. Silas reported that the pamphlets were being printed in a secret cellar near the docks, financed by an anonymous benefactor with deep pockets. The common folk were beginning to believe the stories of the Ghost Queen. Eleanor realized the threat was not just a few disgruntled writers, but a coordinated attempt to destabilize her silent reign and expose her to the light of day. Inside a smoke-filled basement beneath a popular coffee house, a charismatic orator addressed a crowd of restless men. He spoke of the king's strange absences and the woman in the walls who dictated the laws of the land. His words were a spark in a dry forest. These men were shopkeepers, soldiers, and minor clerks, people who felt the weight of laws they didn't understand. The orator held up a list of decrees, claiming they were written in a feminine hand. Eleanor, watching through a hidden grate above, saw the faces of her enemies for the first time, realizing their conviction was fueled by a yearning for transparency. Returning to the palace, Eleanor began her counteroffensive. She would not use force, for martyrs only strengthen a cause. Instead, she would use the very weapon her enemies employed: misinformation. She spent the remaining hours of darkness drafting letters in a variety of hands, creating a web of conflicting rumors to drown out the truth. She suggested the secret queen was a French spy, or perhaps a collective of monks. By saturating the coffee houses with lies, She hoped to turn the genuine mystery into a laughable conspiracy theory, protecting her identity by hiding it behind 1,000 false masks. King George, the man the world believed was in control, paced nervously in the private chambers. He was a shell of a man, his mind frayed by the pressures of a crown he barely wore. He confronted Eleanor, his voice trembling as he showed her a pamphlet he had found in his own carriage. He feared the people would storm the palace if they realized he was merely her mouthpiece. Eleanor stood firm, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to his frantic movements. She reminded him that without her, he would have lost his head to the mob years ago. Their partnership was a cage for them both. The following night, Eleanor's agents moved to silence the press. They didn't burn the printing house, as that would attract the city guard. Instead, they sabotaged the machinery and stole the specific lead types used for the pamphlets. In the darkness of the printing shop, a struggle ensued with a lone watchman. No blood was shed, but the message was clear. Someone was watching. Eleanor herself stood in the doorway, observing the efficiency of her men. She picked up a single metal letter Q from the floor, a tiny piece of the puzzle that had almost unraveled her entire world, tucking it into her glove. Among the seized documents from the printing house, Eleanor discovered a ledger hidden beneath a floorboard. It wasn't filled with names, but with coded transactions. As she deciphered the entries back at the palace, a chilling realization took hold. The money supporting the radicals wasn't coming from the lower classes or foreign enemies. It was coming from the royal treasury itself. Someone within her own administration, someone she trusted to manage the kingdom's finances, was actively funding the movement to expose her. The betrayal was internal, making the threat far more intimate and dangerous than she had ever imagined. She summoned Lord Vane, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to a private meeting in the palace gardens at midnight. Vane was a man of cold ambition, his face an unreadable mask of courtly politeness. Eleanor didn't accuse him directly. Instead, she spoke in metaphors about gardeners who plant weeds in their own soil. The tension was palpable in the freezing night air. Vane's eyes flickered with a brief moment of recognition. He knew that she knew. He didn't flinch, suggesting that he wasn't acting alone. The shadow rule was no longer a secret to the elite. It was now a target for their own power grabs. To regain control of the narrative, Eleanor orchestrated a public spectacle. Under the guise of a cleansing of seditious materials, the king ordered a massive bonfire in the center of London. Thousands of pamphlets, the fake ones Eleanor had printed, were tossed into the flames. The public watched as the lies about a secret queen were reduced to ash. It was a masterstroke of theater. By burning the evidence of her existence herself, she made the truth look like a defeated fiction. As the orange glow of the fire lit the faces of the crowd, Eleanor watched from a high balcony, a ghost among the gargoyles. Despite the successful public ruse, Eleanor knew the fire hadn't burned the real threat. Back in her inner sanctum, she stared at her reflection in a silver mirror. The lines of age and stress were becoming harder to hide. She realized that to survive, she had to find the true architect of the descent. Not just the financier, but the mind that understood her own tactics so well. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her youngest maid, a girl she had treated like a daughter, entered with a tray of tea. For a fleeting second, Eleanor saw a flicker of steel in the girl's eyes. The enemy was closer than she ever dreamed. Eleanor masked her suspicion with a forced smile, accepting the steaming cup of tea. She watched Isabella move with a practiced grace that suddenly felt more like predatory stealth than subservient duty. The room grew cold as the queen mentioned a specific noble name, watching for a reaction. Isabella's hand trembled for a microsecond, the first crack in her perfect mask. Eleanor realized her sanctuary had become a cage. She had to play the part of the unsuspecting mistress while her mind frantically calculated a counter-move. The tea sat untouched between them, a silent testament to the poison of mistrust brewing in the heart of the palace. After Isabella departed, Eleanor conducted a clandestine inspection of the girls' living quarters under the guise of a routine security sweep. Beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, she discovered a small, cold object wrapped in gray silk. It was a signet ring, bearing the ancient crest of the House of Lancaster, but with a jagged line struck through the center. This was the mark of the exiled ones, a faction Eleanor thought she had eradicated decades ago. The discovery sent a chill through her veins. The rebellion wasn't just funded by merchants, it was fueled by dynastic vengeance hidden right under her nose. Guided by the signet, Eleanor descended into the palace's deepest vaults where the forbidden chronicles were kept. The air was thick with the scent of old ink, dust, and rot. She searched for the cursed lineage records, her fingers tracing the spines of massive leather-bound volumes. As she turned the brittle, yellowed pages, she found a name that shouldn't have existed: Margaret Beaufort's secret daughter. The birth dates aligned perfectly with Isabella's age. The girl wasn't just a maid, she was a claimant to the throne, hidden in plain sight, serving the woman she believed stole her birthright. The complexity of the betrayal was staggering. Eleanor realized that Isabella was merely the weapon, not the hand that wielded it. She recalled the Silent Whisperer, a strategist who had nearly toppled the crown during the winter famine years ago. If Isabella was of the House of Lancaster, her handler had to be someone with deep knowledge of royal protocol and internal palace weaknesses. Eleanor began to map out the connections on a piece of parchment, her quill scratching fiercely in the dark. The web of deceit extended from the kitchens to the High Council. She was surrounded by ghosts who had finally learned how to touch the living world. To flush out Isabella's handler, Eleanor orchestrated a fake meeting in the moonlit garden, leaking word that she was vulnerable and seeking a secret alliance. From the shadows of a stone gargoyle, she watched the garden path. A figure cloaked in heavy wool approached Isabella, and they spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Eleanor could not see the stranger's face, but the posture was hauntingly familiar. The stiff military gait of a man who once served as her own captain of the guard. The betrayal ran deeper than blood. It involved the very men she had trusted to protect her life and her secrets. The next morning, Eleanor summoned Isabella to the great library. The room was a labyrinth of knowledge, but today it felt like an interrogation chamber. Eleanor didn't accuse the girl immediately. She simply placed the Lancaster signet ring on the table between them. The silence was deafening. Isabella's facade finally broke, replaced by a cold, regal stare that matched Eleanor's own. The girl didn't beg for mercy or deny the charge. Instead, she spoke of the Great Correction, a plan to restore the true line. Eleanor realized she wasn't facing a mere servant, but a revolutionary who believed her cause was holy. "You think you can stop us by catching one girl?" Isabella asked, her voice devoid of fear. She revealed that the shadows had infiltrated every level of the palace. For every maid Eleanor arrested, 10 more were waiting in the wings, invisible hands that cooked the food, washed the linens, and carried the royal messages. The secret queen realized her power was an illusion if the very foundation of her household was built on the loyalty of her enemies. The psychological weight of this revelation began to take its toll, forcing Eleanor to reconsider her isolation and the way she governed. Eleanor knew she could not execute a mass purge Without sparking a palace-wide panic or an immediate coup, she had to be surgical. She began to promote the suspected servants to distant estates, scattering the network before they could strike as a unified force. It was a delicate dance of logistics and deception. She watched from her balcony as the first carriage of loyal servants departed, knowing that among them were the assassins who meant to end her reign. Every departure was a victory for her safety, but every empty room in the palace made her more vulnerable to the silence. While clearing Isabella's former station, Eleanor found a hidden compartment in a laundry basket. Inside was the Black Ledger, a meticulous record of every secret the shadows had gathered over the years. It contained the Queen's own darkest deeds, written in an elegant, familiar hand. As she read the entries, she recognized the cipher. It belonged to her former mentor, Lord Thomas, who was supposedly executed for treason 10 years ago. The realization hit like a physical blow. The man who taught her how to rule from the shadows was the one now pulling the strings against her from the grave. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Thomas hadn't died. He had staged his death to become the ultimate shadow, a ghost in the machinery of state. He had spent a decade grooming Isabella and the others to be his instruments of revenge. Eleanor stood alone in the dark corridor, the Black Ledger clutched to her chest. She was no longer just fighting for her crown. She was fighting the man who knew her every thought and tactic. The game had evolved from a political struggle into a personal war between master and student, and the palace was their battlefield. Eleanor paced the damp stone corridors, her mind racing. If Thomas had survived, every servant, every guard, and every page could be his eyes. The palace she once called home now felt like a cage woven with invisible threads. She couldn't trust the food she ate or the letters she received. To survive this silent war, she had to dismantle the network he had spent a decade building. She began by summoning the captain of the guard, a man whose loyalty was bought with secrets rather than gold. The purge would be quiet, efficient, and absolute, leaving Thomas blind within the palace walls. Far from the gilded halls, in a derelict townhouse overlooking the Thames, Thomas sat amidst a sea of maps and correspondence. He didn't need a crown to rule. He only needed the perception of power. He began leaking carefully constructed lies to the city's criers, rumors of a queen mother who had lost her mind and a king who was a mere puppet. The public's faith was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a master of manipulation. Thomas watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, knowing that every riot in the streets was a blow to Eleanor's crumbling authority. To fight a ghost, Eleanor sought the wisdom of the dead. She descended into the royal archives, a labyrinth of dust and forgotten history. Somewhere within these scrolls was the record of Thomas's original death, the witnesses, the physician, and the signatures that had validated the lie. If she could find the flaw in his past, she could destroy his present. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and neglect. As she turned the heavy pages of the ledger, she realized that Thomas hadn't just faked his death. He had erased his entire existence from the official records, leaving only void. The first strike from Thomas was not a blade in the dark, but a collapse of the realm's coin. Thomas had used his hidden connections to flood the market with debased currency, devaluing the royal seal. Merchants refused to trade, and the city's economy ground to a halt. Eleanor watched from the balcony as angry crowds gathered at the palace gates, demanding answers she couldn't give. This was Thomas's signature move, attacking the foundations of the state to make the leader appear incompetent. He was forcing her into a corner, making her choose between the people and her pride. Eleanor retreated into the secret passageways built by her ancestors. the only places Thomas's eyes couldn't reach. Here, she spread out her own maps, marking the locations of Thomas's known associates. She was no longer the student. She was a sovereign defending her realm. She began to coordinate a counterintelligence operation, using the very methods Thomas had taught her. She would feed him false information, lure him into a sense of security, and then strike where he was most vulnerable. His ego. The game of shadows had entered a new phase where every move was a gamble against an invisible opponent. High above the city, in the belfry of an abandoned church, Thomas observed the palace through a brass spyglass. He saw the shift in Eleanor's tactics. She was closing the gaps, tightening her security, and vanishing from public view. He smiled, a thin, joyless expression. She was doing exactly what he had trained her to do, but she was still playing by the rules of the palace. Thomas had no such limitations. He signaled to a hooded figure waiting in the rafters. It was time to introduce a new player into the game, one who would force Eleanor to step out of the shadows and expose herself. Isabella emerged as the public face of the righteous reformers, a group Thomas had covertly funded. She spoke to the masses with a conviction that Eleanor lacked, promising a return to traditional values and an end to the shadow rule of the Queen Mother. Her beauty and charisma were potent weapons, making her a darling of the common folk. Eleanor watched from her window, realizing that Thomas was using Isabella to dismantle her reputation from the outside, while he eroded her power from within. The girl who was once a pawn had become a formidable queen-in-waiting, backed by a ghost. Eleanor pored over the black ledger, her eyes burning from the dim light. She found a list of names she hadn't recognized before, names of powerful lords who were supposedly loyal to the crown, but were actually indebted to a mysterious patron. Thomas had been buying the aristocracy for years, using their debts and scandals to bind them to his will. This was his true army. Eleanor realized that to win, she didn't need to fight Thomas directly. She needed to break the chains he held over these men. She began drafting letters of her own, offering a choice: royal pardon or public ruin. At the stroke of midnight, Eleanor entered the throne room, expecting it to be empty. Instead, she found a single black rose resting on the seat of the king. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Thomas could reach the heart of the palace whenever he wished. The air felt cold, the silence oppressive. She stood before the empty throne, the weight of the crown she didn't wear pressing down on her. Thomas was mocking her, reminding her that even in her own sanctuary, she was never truly safe. The psychological war was beginning to take its toll on her iron resolve. Eleanor finally visited her son, the king, only to find him a shadow of his former self. He was lethargic, his eyes clouded, and his mind wandering. She suspected Thomas had been using a subtle poison or psychological manipulation through the king's personal physician, another of his hidden agents. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Thomas didn't just want to take the throne. He wanted to hollow it out until there was nothing left but a shell. Eleanor knelt by her son's bed, vowing to find an antidote, both for his body and for the kingdom Thomas was systematically poisoning. Eleanor retreats from her son's bedside, her mind a whirlwind of calculated fury. She knows that to save him, she must first find the source of his slow decay. Under the shroud of a moonless night, she navigates the damp, subterranean tunnels of the castle, heading toward the physician's private quarters. Her silk gown rustles against the stone walls, a sound like a warning. She suspects the court doctor, a man named Harlan, of being Thomas's primary instrument. In the flickering torchlight, Her face is a mask of cold determination, her every step bringing her closer to the heart of the conspiracy that has turned her son into a hollow vessel. The physician's study is a labyrinth of glass vials and crumbling scrolls. Eleanor enters silently, her eyes scanning the disarray for any sign of the toxin. The air is heavy with the scent of bitter almonds and dried nightshade. She meticulously sifts through parchment records, looking for irregularities in the king's medicinal logs. Every scratch of the quill and every smudge of ink tells a story of systematic betrayal. In the shadows, she finds a hidden compartment behind a shelf of heavy leather-bound tomes, containing a vial of a strange, iridescent blue liquid that has no place in a standard medical cabinet. Examining the iridescent liquid, Eleanor realizes this is no ordinary poison. It is the widow's weep, a rare extract that numbs the mind before it stops the heart. The treachery is deep, reaching back into the dark trade routes of the East. She clutches the vial, her knuckles white with tension. She knows Harlan couldn't have procured this alone. The supply lines lead directly back to Thomas's treasury. The realization solidifies her resolve. She must create an antidote in absolute secrecy, for if Thomas learns she has discovered his method, he will surely accelerate the king's final illness to consolidate his power immediately. Eleanor confronts Dr. Harlan in the flickering gloom of the castle's lower laboratory. The man cowers as she presents the blue vial, her gaze piercing through his pathetic excuses. She doesn't use steel. She uses the weight of her authority and the threat of a public execution that would strip his family of everything. The doctor's hands tremble as he confesses to the doses he administered under Thomas's orders. In this dark, cinematic space, the power dynamic shifts. Eleanor demands the formula for the counter-agent, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that echoes against the vaulted stone ceilings, demanding the truth before the candle burns out. Realizing Harlan is too terrified to be fully useful, Eleanor seeks out an old ally, a master alchemist named Silas, who once served her father. He lives in a secluded cottage on the edge of the royal woods, hidden by mist and silence. She arrives disguised as a common traveler, the heavy cloak obscuring her royal finery. Silas, a man of withered skin and sharp eyes, recognizes her immediately. In the dim light of his workshop, surrounded by drying herbs and ancient iron cauldrons, she explains the king's plight. The documentary tone of their meeting underscores the gravity. This is a desperate alliance forged in the shadows of an empire. Throughout the night, Silas and Eleanor work tirelessly, the glow of the furnace casting long, dancing shadows against the parchment-covered walls. The process is delicate, requiring precise measurements of rare moss and crushed gemstones. The alchemist's hands, though gnarled with age, move with surgical precision. Muted colors of amber and deep indigo fill the room as the antidote begins to simmer. Eleanor watches the liquid intently, her reflection caught in the bubbling surface. She is no longer just a mother or a queen. She is a master of the hidden arts, reclaiming the destiny of her lineage through science and secrecy. Back at the palace, Thomas grows suspicious of Eleanor's frequent absences. He stands in the high gallery, his silhouette framed by the cold moonlight, looking down into the courtyard. He senses a change in the air, a ripple in the stillness he had carefully manufactured. He orders his guards to double the watch on the king's chambers and to monitor the Queen Mother's every movement. The atmosphere is thick with tension, a psychological game of chess where every move is observed from the shadows. Thomas's face is a study in cold ambition, his eyes searching the darkness for the threat he knows is coming. Eleanor returns to the castle, the antidote hidden within a false-bottomed jewelry box. The challenge is now the gauntlet of guards Thomas has placed at her son's door. She uses her knowledge of the castle's secret architectural flaws, navigating through a narrow passage behind the tapestries in the Great Hall. The dust of centuries chokes the air, but she does not falter. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. She reaches the king's bedchamber from behind a heavy oak wardrobe, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepares to face the guards outside the main door. Inside the bedchamber, the king lies still, his breath shallow and ragged. Eleanor emerges from the shadows like a ghost, moving to his side with practiced silence. She ignores the muffled voices of the guards in the hallway, focusing entirely on the task at hand. With a steady hand, she tilts his head back and administers the first few drops of Silas's concoction. The liquid is a deep, murky green, the color of hope and hemlock. She whispers words of encouragement into his ear, her voice a lifeline pulling him back from the precipice of a manufactured madness, praying the cure acts faster than the poison. As the first light of dawn filters through the high, arched windows, the king's eyelids flutter. It is a small movement, barely perceptible, but to Eleanor it is a triumph. The gray pallor of his skin begins to fade, replaced by a faint, healthy flush. However, the sound of heavy boots approaching the door signals that her time has run out. Thomas is coming to check on his patient. Eleanor must vanish back into the secret passages before she is discovered, leaving her son to face the first stages of his recovery alone in the lion's den. The war for the crown has only just begun. Eleanor slips through the hidden masonry door, just as the heavy iron latch of the main entrance groans. Behind her, the door clicks shut with a sound no louder than a heartbeat. Thomas enters the royal chamber, his footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. He approaches the bed with a predatory grace, expecting to see the king drifting closer to death. Instead, he pauses, his eyes narrowing. The gray pallor has lifted, replaced by a subtle warmth in the king's skin. Thomas reaches out a gloved hand to touch the king's brow, his expression shifting from arrogance to a brewing, dangerous suspicion. Hidden behind the tapestry, Eleanor watches through a narrow slit in the stone. Her breath is shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sees Thomas sweep his gaze across the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. He notices the slight scent of medicinal herbs lingering in the stagnant air, scents that he did not authorize. He moves toward the very wall where Eleanor hides, his shadow stretching long and thin across the floorboards. The tension is palpable as he stands inches away, his fingers brushing the fabric of the tapestry, contemplating the secrets hidden within the palace walls. Thomas retreats from the wall, but his suspicion remains etched into his features. He realizes that the king's recovery is not a miracle, but an intervention. He summons a guard, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carries through the hidden passages. He orders the perimeter of the royal wing to be sealed and every servant to be interrogated. Eleanor realizes her mobility is now severely limited. The palace, once her playground of shadows, is becoming a cage. She must find a way to reach her loyalists before Thomas turns the entire castle into an inescapable fortress against her. In the great council chamber, the lords gather under the weight of an uncertain future. Thomas stands at the head of the long oak table, his face a mask of false concern. He tells the gathered nobility that the king's mind has finally fractured, claiming that the monarch is seeing ghosts and speaking to walls. He argues that for the safety of the realm, a formal regency must be established immediately, with himself as the sole protector. The lords murmur in hushed, worried tones, unaware that the queen they believe dead is listening to every word from the darkness above the rafters. Eleanor knows she cannot act alone. She maneuvers through the narrow, dust-choked vents to the barracks of the royal guard. There, she spots Sir Alistair, a knight whose family has served her line for generations. She drops a small silver signet ring through a grate, watching as it clatters at his feet. Alistair freezes, recognizing the crest instantly. He looks up toward the shadows, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and renewed hope. In that moment, a silent pact is forged. The queen has her first soldier in the war for the throne. Under the cover of a torrential downpour, Alistair meets a hooded figure in the cloisters of the old abbey. The rain washes over the stone gargoyles, mirroring the tears of a neglected kingdom. Eleanor reveals herself, her face partially obscured by a dark cloak. She speaks of the king's recovery and Thomas's treachery. They must move the king to a secure location, but the palace is crawling with Thomas's mercenaries. Alistair warns that a direct extraction is suicide. They need a distraction, something that will draw the guards away from the royal chambers long enough to spirit the king away. Back in the royal bedchamber, the king's eyes snap open with a clarity they haven't possessed in months. He watches Thomas approach with a scroll in hand, a document of abdication. The king feels the phantom warmth of his mother's touch still lingering on his skin, giving him a strength he didn't know he had. When Thomas demands he sign, the king finds his voice. Though it is thin and raspy, he refuses, his words a defiance that echoes against the stone walls. Thomas's face contorts with rage. The mask of the loyal servant is finally beginning to slip. Thomas slams the scroll onto the bedside table, his patience exhausted. He threatens the king with permanent isolation, claiming that if he will not sign, he will simply be forgotten while the world moves on. As Thomas storms out, he notices a small embroidered handkerchief on the floor, one bearing the queen's personal cipher. He picks it up, his knuckles turning white as he grips the fabric. He realizes the ghost haunting the palace is flesh and blood. The hunt for Eleanor becomes personal, and he orders his men to tear down the tapestries and search every hollow wall. Deep beneath the palace, in the forgotten wine cellars, Eleanor assembles her shadow court. These are the laundry maids, the stable boys, and the scullery workers who have seen and heard everything. They are her eyes and ears in the places the High Lords never look. She spreads a map across an old barrel, lit by a single flickering candle. They whisper of secret routes and guard rotations. To the world, they are invisible, but under Eleanor's command, they are a formidable intelligence network. The counter-coup is no longer a dream. It is a mechanical certainty being assembled in the dark. As the moon rises over the jagged spires of the palace, the atmosphere reaches a breaking point. Thomas has placed guards at every door, unaware that the threat is already inside the walls. Eleanor stands at the entrance of a forgotten passage that leads directly into the council chamber. She can hear the lords arguing, their voices muffled by the thick stone. She knows that tomorrow, Thomas plans to declare the king legally dead to the world. She adjusts her mantle, her eyes reflecting the cold resolve of a ruler who has waited long enough. The time for shadows is ending. Eleanor enters the narrow crawlspace behind the masonry. The air is stale, smelling of centuries-old dust and forgotten secrets. She moves with a grace born of desperation, her fingers trailing along the damp, cold walls. Every step is a calculated risk, echoing softly against the heavy stone. Ahead, the low murmur of the lords grows louder, vibrating through the floorboards. She is no longer just a wife or a figurehead. She is the guardian of a kingdom's true bloodline. The path is tight, pressing against her mantle. But her resolve is unyielding as she nears the heart of the palace's power. In the council chamber, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old ink. Thomas stands at the head of the massive oak table, his silhouette cast long and jagged against the stone walls by the flickering candlelight. He addresses the gathered lords with a voice of feigned sorrow, weaving a narrative of a king whose spirit has finally departed. The lords sit in uneasy silence, their faces etched with doubt and fear. The weight of the moment hangs heavy, as the very foundation of the British monarchy teeters on the edge of a manufactured tragedy. Thomas reaches into his doublet and withdraws a heavy, wax-sealed parchment. This is the instrument of his ultimate move, the decree of succession. He lays it upon the table with a deliberate, echoing thud. The document claims the king passed in his sleep, naming Thomas as the temporary protector until a new heir is found. The ink is dark and fresh, a stark contrast to the ancient lineage it seeks to overwrite. The lords lean in, their eyes scanning the script, searching for the truth hidden between the lines of Thomas's carefully crafted lies. Lord Hastings, an elderly statesman with eyes that have seen 3 reigns, begins to stand. He questions the lack of witnesses and the suddenness of the king's passing. The room falls into a deathly quiet. Thomas turns toward him, his expression hardening into a mask of cold authority. The flickering torchlight emphasizes the sharp lines of Thomas's face, casting deep shadows that swallow his eyes. He reminds Hastings of the consequences of treason during a time of national mourning. The threat is unspoken but understood, stifling any further dissent as the lords sink back into their seats. Behind the heavy velvet tapestry of the great hall, Eleanor finds the hidden latch. Her pulse thrums in her fingertips as she feels the cold metal give way. She is mere inches from the council, separated only by a layer of fabric and the weight of tradition. She can hear Thomas's voice rising in triumph, believing his victory is secure. Eleanor takes a final, steadying breath, the parchment texture of her own secret records pressed against her chest. She prepares to step into the light, ending the era of shadows and reclaiming the voice that has guided the throne in silence. The tapestry ripples, and Eleanor steps forth into the center of the chamber. The shock is instantaneous. The lords gasp as if they have seen a ghost. She stands bathed in the amber glow of the hearth, her presence commanding and undeniable. Thomas's face pales, the blood draining from his features as his carefully constructed reality begins to shatter. She does not look like a grieving widow, but a reigning monarch. The silence that follows is absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the collective intake of breath from the men who thought they ruled alone. Eleanor advances toward the head of the table, her eyes locked on Thomas. She does not raise her voice, but her words carry the weight of iron. She accuses him of fabricating the king's death and betraying the crown. Thomas tries to interject, his hands trembling as he clutches the false decree. But the authority in Eleanor's gaze stops him cold. The lords watch the exchange, their loyalties shifting like sand in a storm. The dramatic lighting of the hall highlights the contrast between the Queen's steady resolve and the usurper's growing panic. Outside the chamber, the heavy oak doors groan as the guards, hearing the commotion, burst inside. They stop in their tracks, caught between the command of Thomas and the regal presence of the Queen. Thomas shouts for them to seize the impostor, but his voice cracks with desperation. The guards look to one another, then to Eleanor, who stands with the poise of an ancient monument. The historical gravity of the moment paralyzes them. In this dark cinematic space, the power does not lie with the man who holds the sword, but with the woman who holds the truth. Eleanor produces a letter bearing the king's own private seal, dated only hours ago. She reads aloud the king's final commands, which name her as the sole voice of the throne during his illness. The revelation hits the council like a physical blow. The document, weathered and authentic, stands in stark contrast to Thomas's forged decree. The graphic novel style of the scene emphasizes the dramatic shift in power, as the lords realize they have been manipulated. Eleanor's voice remains calm and documentary-like, laying out the facts of Thomas's betrayal with clinical precision. Thomas is forced to step away from the head of the table. His reign of shadows is over, replaced by the very woman he sought to eclipse. The lords bow their heads, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, profound recognition of who has truly been leading them. Eleanor takes her place at the seat of power, the muted colors of the room reflecting the somber reality of the task ahead. The palace remains a place of mystery, but for the first time in years, the queen rules not from the shadows, but from the throne itself. Eleanor sits in the grand study, the same room where Thomas once plotted. Before her lie stacks of parchment, letters, ledgers, and secret pacts that detail the extent of his overreach. She doesn't burn them, she studies them. Every inked name is a debt to be collected, or a mistake to be rectified. The transition from silent advisor to active ruler is heavy, felt in the weight of the crown she now openly acknowledges. The air in the room is thick with the scent of old paper and the residue of a legacy built on lies, which she must now dismantle. News of the shift in power travels through the palace corridors like a cold draft. The lords and ladies, once comfortable in their petty squabbles under Thomas's predictable greed, now find themselves unsettled by the Queen's quiet intensity. They gather in the gallery, whispering behind fans and velvet gloves. They recall her as a ghost in the background, a silent figure in the corners of portraits. Now she is the sun around which they must orbit. The mystery of her long-hidden influence fascinates and terrifies them, as they realize how much she truly knows about each of their hidden agendas. Eleanor's first official act is a strike against the corruption that bled the northern provinces dry. While Thomas focused on courtly prestige, the common folk suffered. She signs a decree redirecting the royal treasury toward relief and infrastructure. Her hand is steady, the quill scratching against the heavy vellum with a sound like a sharpening blade. She understands that to rule effectively, she must first heal the wounds inflicted by her predecessor's vanity. The ministers standing by are stunned by her decisiveness. They expected a figurehead, but they have found a tactician who has been planning this for decades. Lord Vane, one of Thomas's most loyal henchmen, attempts to challenge the Queen's authority during a private audience. He speaks of tradition and the natural order, implying that a woman cannot navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy alone. Eleanor lets him speak, her gaze never wavering. When he finishes, she recounts a specific meeting 10 years prior, where Vane accepted a bribe from a French emissary, a meeting he thought was secret. The color drains from his face as he realizes the Queen was always watching from the shadows. Her voice is low, calm, and utterly terrifying. The sun sets over London, casting the city in shades of charcoal and bruised purple. Inside the royal bedchamber, Eleanor removes her heavy robes, feeling the chill of the stone floor. She stands by the window, looking out over the kingdom she has saved and stolen at the same time. The cost of her secrecy has been her own life. She has no memories of youth that aren't tainted by the need for survival. The weight of her solitude is the price of the crown. There is no joy in her victory, only the grim satisfaction of a task finally begun. Beneath the floorboards of Thomas's former study, Eleanor's guards discover a hidden chest. Inside, it contains a ledger written in a code only she and the late king understood. As she deciphers the pages, she realizes Thomas wasn't just greedy. He was being blackmailed by a foreign power. The discovery changes everything. Her fight isn't just internal. The very sovereignty of Britain is under threat from an unseen enemy across the sea. The documents are old, the ink fading on the yellowed parchment, but the implications are fresh and dangerous. She must move quickly before the enemy realizes Thomas is gone. The palace guard is purged. Those who took coin from Thomas or his foreign handlers are stripped of their rank and escorted to the tower. Eleanor replaces them with men and women she has vetted personally over the years, those who stayed loyal to the crown even when the crown seemed to have forgotten them. The atmosphere in the palace shifts from one of paranoia to one of disciplined order. The metallic clatter of armor on stone replaces the soft rustle of whispered conspiracies. The queen is building an army of the faithful, preparing for the storm she knows is coming. Envoys from the Spanish and French courts arrive, expecting to negotiate with a weakened, grieving widow or a puppet of the lords. They are ushered into the throne room, where Eleanor sits alone, without a counsel to whisper in her ear. Her sharp wit and intimate knowledge of their own domestic troubles leave them speechless. She doesn't use the flowery language of courtly romance. She speaks in the cold terms of power and consequence. By the end of the day, the foreign ambassadors realize that Britain is more formidable than it has been in a generation, led by a woman who knows their secrets. In the quiet of the royal chapel, Eleanor kneels before the altar. The air is cold, smelling of incense and ancient dust. She does not pray for forgiveness for her deceptions. She prays for the strength to continue them where necessary. The flickering candlelight reflects in her eyes, showing a hardness that few have ever seen. She knows that being a secret queen was only the first trial. To lead her people into the new era, she must remain as vigilant and as calculating as she was when she lived in the shadows. The cross above the altar looms large, a silent witness to her resolve. As the first rays of a gray London morning break through the fog, the queen stands on the balcony of the palace. Below, the city begins to wake. The transition is complete. The shadow has become the substance. Eleanor is no longer the hidden hand. She is the visible force of the law and the protector of the realm. But as she looks toward the horizon, she knows the mysteries of the British throne are far from solved. Her reign will be defined by the secrets she keeps and the truths she chooses to reveal. The story of the secret queen has ended, and the reign of Eleanor has begun. The transition from the shadows to the throne was not merely a change of location, but a fundamental shift in the machinery of British power. Queen Eleanor convened her first official council in the Great Hall, where once she had watched from behind heavy tapestries. The lords and ministers, accustomed to her absence, now found themselves under her direct, piercing gaze. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. Eleanor made it clear that while she wore the crown publicly, the meticulous intelligence networks she had built would remain the foundation of her rule. The era of the puppet master had evolved into the era of the sovereign. Her first decree was to formalize the group that had helped her rule from the dark. She summoned the Whisperers to the palace's lower sanctum, a room hidden beneath the royal library. These were the men and women who knew her secret journey better than anyone. Eleanor explained that their work would now be the realm's official intelligence service, though their existence would remain a secret to the common folk. This paradox, a public queen with a private army of spies, ensured that no move was made in London without her knowledge. The foundation of her new Britain was being laid in the very dust of the old. Despite her newfound transparency, Eleanor was haunted by the possibility of other hidden players. She spent her nights in the royal archives, meticulously scouring records of past monarchs. She sought any mention of predecessors who might have ruled through similar deception. As the candlelight flickered against the damp stone walls, she uncovered a series of coded entries dating back centuries. It became clear that she was not the first secret queen, but merely the first to claim her place in the light. The realization that she was part of a long, invisible lineage added a new layer of gravity to her burden. The public coronation, though a formality, was a spectacle designed to project absolute stability. As Eleanor walked through Westminster Abbey, the weight of the ceremonial robes felt heavier than any secret she had ever carried. The eyes of the world were upon her, searching for weakness in the woman who had appeared from nowhere to claim the throne. She kept her pace measured, and her face a mask of stoic resolve. Beneath the grand music and the cheers of the crowd, Eleanor felt the cold reality of her position. To lead was to be alone, even in a room full of thousands. But the emergence of a queen from the shadows did not please everyone. Those who had profited from the previous chaos began to stir. In the dark corners of London's elite clubs, whispered conspiracies formed. These men preferred a monarch who was a figurehead, not an active player with an intimate knowledge of their crimes. Eleanor, through her network of informants, heard every word. She did not move to arrest them immediately. Instead, she let them know she was watching. A single black wax seal left on a conspirator's desk was a more effective warning than a dozen guards. The game of shadows had simply moved to a larger board. Eleanor began to weave her invisible law into the fabric of the nation. She reformed the justice system, replacing corrupt magistrates with those she knew were loyal to the realm rather than to coin. These changes were often presented as the work of Parliament, but the guiding hand was always hers. She met with legal scholars in the dead of night, drafting policies that would protect the commoner from the predatory whims of the aristocracy. The secret queen was becoming a champion of the people, though they would never know the full extent of the risks she took to secure their rights. In the solitude of the royal gardens at twilight, Eleanor often reflected on the price of her ascension. The garden, a maze of meticulously groomed hedges and ancient stone statues, mirrored the complexity of her own life. She walked the paths where previous queens had strolled, wondering if they too had felt like prisoners of their own status. The silence was her only true confidant. Here, away from the prying eyes of the court and the demands of the state, she allowed herself a moment of quiet grief for the life of anonymity she had traded for the crown. The shadow had become the sun, but the heat was sometimes unbearable. Outside the palace walls, the legend of the hidden lady who saved the throne grew into a folk myth. In the taverns and markets of London, people spoke of her in hushed tones, blending fact with fiction. Some said she was a ghost of a forgotten princess. Others claimed she was a sorceress who could see through walls. Eleanor encouraged these rumors, knowing that a bit of mystique served as a powerful deterrent to rebellion. If the people believed she was more than human, they were less likely to challenge her authority. She remained an enigma, even as her face was minted onto the realm's coins. The most dangerous threat came not from the streets, but from the very heart of the old regime. A high-ranking duke, who had once been a close ally of the previous king, attempted to blackmail Eleanor with forged documents questioning her legitimacy. He met her in a private gallery, confident that his threats would force her back into the shadows. Eleanor, however, was prepared. She produced the original documents, which her spies had recovered weeks prior and revealed evidence of the Duke's own treason. Without a drop of blood shed, she dismantled his power, proving that a queen who knows everyone's secrets is invincible. As the first year of her visible reign drew to a close, Eleanor realized that ruling in the light was a different kind of war. In the shadows, she had been a surgeon, cutting out rot with precision. On the throne, she was a gardener, forced to nurture the whole while dealing with the same rot in a more public arena. The burden of transparency meant her every word was scrutinized, yet she still maintained her secret networks. She sat at her desk, the morning sun rising over London, and began to write her true history in a journal that would remain hidden for centuries. The secret queen was now a legend. The years passed as Eleanor maintained the delicate equilibrium between her public persona and her private influence. Her hair had turned the color of winter fog, and the lines on her face were a map of every secret kept and every command whispered. She often stood by the high windows of the palace, watching the city of London evolve, knowing that the very foundations of its stability were built upon the unseen work of her agents. She was the architect of a peace the people attributed to God, unaware that their savior was a woman who lived in the dark. Eleanor knew that her time was finite, but the machinery of the shadows had to outlive her. She selected a young noblewoman, Jane, whose intellect was as sharp as a stiletto and whose loyalty was absolute. In the damp, torch-lit archives of the palace, Eleanor began the final phase of her reign, the passing of the torch. She taught Jane how to read the codes hidden in trade ledgers and how to identify a spy by the way they held a teacup. The secret monarchy was no longer a person. It was becoming a tradition, a silent inheritance. One evening, an old adversary, a duke who had once plotted her downfall, was brought before her in private. He was broken and forgotten by the court, but Eleanor saw in him the last vestige of the world she had conquered. She did not execute him. Instead, she showed him the ledger of his own failures, documented by her spies over decades. It was a cold, clinical demonstration of power. She let him live, knowing that the knowledge of her absolute reach was a more profound prison than any dungeon. The Shadow Queen's mercy was its own form of cruelty. Knew that if this book were found too soon, it would burn the kingdom to the ground. She sought out a hidden chamber beneath the royal chapel, a place forgotten even by the stonemasons. There, behind a false wall marked only by a faint cipher, she placed the journal. It was her final act of concealment, ensuring her legend would remain a mystery until the world was ready. The day of her final public appearance was a cold, gray morning. Thousands gathered to see the queen who had brought such unexpected longevity to the crown. She stood on the balcony, draped in heavy furs and the weight of 1,000 secrets. To the public, she was a symbol of divine right. To herself, she was the ghost that had haunted the halls of power for a lifetime. She waved a frail hand, a final gesture of goodbye to a people who would never truly know her, yet owed her their very lives. In the quiet of her bedchamber, Eleanor summoned the heir to the throne, a young man who believed he was inheriting a simple kingdom. She spoke to him not of glory or gold, but of the whispers in the walls and the patterns in the chaos. She warned him that the crown was a mask, and that the true power lay in what one chose not to say. Her voice was a rasping shadow, a final lesson in the art of the invisible hand. He listened with wide eyes, realizing for the first time that his grandmother was the most dangerous person he had ever known. As the candles burned low on her final night, Eleanor felt the weight of the shadows lifting. She had served her country in a way no history book would ever record. sacrificing her identity for the sake of the realm's survival. There was no fear in her heart, only a profound sense of completion. The secret networks were in place, the journals were hidden, and her successor was prepared. She closed her eyes for the last time, a silent queen returning to the darkness from which she had ruled with such terrifying and beautiful precision. For the visible queen, while the members of her secret order watched from the alleyways and rooftops, mourning the woman who had been their true commander. To the world, a monarch had passed. To the initiates of the shadow, a goddess had ascended. The duality of her life was mirrored in the contrast between the white marble of her tomb and the dark secrets she took with her. Centuries later, a historian working in the depths of the palace archives noticed a discrepancy in the stone floor of the chapel. Following a series of faint ciphers that had long been dismissed as mason marks, he discovered the hidden chamber Eleanor had prepared. He pulled the ancient journal from the dust, its parchment yellowed, but its ink as sharp as the day it was written. As he read the first page, the true history of Britain began to unravel. The secret queen was no longer a ghost. She was speaking from the grave, her words a final strike against the facade of history. The legacy of Eleanor, the secret queen, remains woven into the very fabric of the modern state. Though her name is rarely spoken in the halls of Parliament, the systems of intelligence and the silent diplomacy she pioneered continue to safeguard the nation. She proved that the truest power does not require a spotlight, but a steady hand in the dark. As the sun sets over the modern Thames, the shadows she once commanded still linger, a reminder that behind every great empire lies a secret history, written by those who chose to rule from the silence.